Thank you, Shadi. Really, I'm really amazed and impressed by all four speakers. You stayed within time and gave a very excellent summary of the main questions and issues that we are dealing with in the case of Egypt. And I guess the last question that Shadi ended with is, can liberals become real Democrats? Is one that we really have to think about. Because what does it mean if you're liberal and you don't really believe in democracy? Are you really a liberal? But I just, before we begin the discussion and the Q&A, I want to say that there are two lessons that maybe we can learn from Tunisia. And the number one is to move as quickly as you can from the presidential system. If you put too much power in the hand of the president, of one man, then you're almost guaranteed that the democratic transition is going to fail. Parliamentarian system is not necessarily the best in the world, but at least power is more evenly distributed rather than controlled by one person. And the other recommendation is the election law that we picked in Tunisia actually punishes the larger parties, doesn't give them a lot of votes. And there are laws that you can do that way so that larger parties like the Muslim Brotherhood cannot get more than 30 or 40% of the seats. So the election law in Tunisia was made to encourage smaller parties and give them more votes. They can get more seats even with a smaller number of votes. Anyway, so we have about 20 to 30 minutes of Q&A. If you have any questions, please, there is a mic over there. Please introduce yourself and be brief, and please
Mustafa
focus
Hamid,
on a question.
Center for Egyptian-American Relations. My question is that during my time in Egypt, my generation used the lowest person in high school will go to the law school, usually 50% or 55%. But there were many noted judges and legal experts. What you described, I think it's a very nice description and diagnosis and so on. How many people in the judiciary system today in Egypt, if you are in contact with them, will share your ideas and will admit all these pitfalls and drawbacks in the system, and why or why not they are sharing your views and accepting it? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take a couple more questions.
Mohammed Shina, Voice of America. Who should lead the push for democracy in Egypt with elitist political parties, oppressed opposition, confined civil society organizations, rubber stamp parliament, and a state takeover of independent media?
Marina Ottawa with the Wilson Center. First of all, a footnote to something that Shadi said. You said that people could not count more than 3 or 4 liberals. The much invoked Amr Hamzawi argued that in that short period that the parliament functioned in 2012, there was a liberal bloc that consisted of exactly 18 people. So maybe it's not as dire as you made it out, although it's not very good. The point that I really wanted to bring up is more in response to what Dalia said. There was a flourishing of pluralism. You had all these liberal parties that came into existence. And I had argued that in reality, those were not political parties. They were individuals that were coming forth in their own name, and that one of the major weakness, I would say, of Egyptian liberals is they have never done any organizing effort. In other words, it's people working in their own names, but never really trying to build up a following, never trying to build up constituencies. In the past, Amr Hamzawi and I wrote quite a bit about the parties without constituencies. And I brought this up with him after the uprising when he in theory, launched a political party that we all know very well never existed, and he was the first one to admit that the party never existed. And, you know, and that was the situation all around. So that essentially, there are things that can be done, I think, to increase the power of liberalism and the influence of liberals. And that is the work, which is not very glorious, which is not very good, but it's the work of organizing and doing something. So let me leave it at that.
Thank you, Marina. We'll take quick answers.
Thank you for those questions. I'll respond first to the judiciary one, then I also want to respond to Marina. So what's happened to the judiciary, the current state, has been an evolution. There used to be, I think it's defunct now, a judicial independence movement, which many people know their leaders, Ahmed Mekki, Bastawisi, Hisham Gneidi, there were many of them, Abdelaziz, Zakaria Abdelaziz. And interestingly, if you look at those leaders, many of whom have now they've retired. They were either pushed into retirement or they aged out at the age of 70, which by the way is 10 years older than all other civil servants. So that's an exception that Mubarak made for the judiciary so he could keep the senior loyalists in place, excluding the judicial independence movement. They were mentees of jurists who really came of age and were trained before 1952 or in the 1950s. So the Egyptian judicial culture has shifted over time to be, I mean, you can say less liberal, or you could just say increasingly captured by the executive, because it's hard to tell whether the product is as a result of structure or a result of individual choice, because we're all, you know, we're a product of our structures. So what my concern is that right now with the law schools still being 50% as the entrance rate, as opposed to doctors and engineers being 98, 99%, you are already not getting the brightest students in Egypt. But that being said, that doesn't mean that none of them are bright. And so there has been proposals to have a judicial training center that after graduation you would have to go and complete a year or two and test and then go into the judiciary so that it would be the best and the brightest. But having said that, so that's the qualifications, but there's also the culture. And I go into a lot of detail into my Independence Without Accountability article about the way that the executive has very strategically and savvily controlled judicial independence through benefits, through, you can end up at southern Egypt where there's no water and no electricity for 5 or 10 years. You get transferred over there, you don't get promoted. The people in the Judges Club will be very upset at you if you're a troublemaker, because the executive can collectively punish the judiciary by cutting off health care, by cutting off interest-free loans. There's all sorts of ways that the executive knows how to discipline state institutions, and the judiciary is not an exception. I would recommend that you read the paper for more detail, but that all to say is these are evolving intergenerational changes, and we need to be thinking big picture, because what we learned in 2011 is one jolt to the system didn't work. And frankly, I think it made it worse from a democracy perspective. And this kind of goes to the liberalism question, or liberals. I really question whether what one sees in Egypt is truly what exists. So there may have been liberals who wanted to oppose the coup. There may have been liberals who wanted to do many things that were consistent with liberal values, but had they done that, they would have been dead, in jail, in self-exile. They couldn't leave the country, and we have those people now. And so, unfortunately, Egypt isn't a place where just because someone stays silent, that necessarily reflects their compliance, right? Their complicity, because the stakes are just so high, and they have families, and they have extended families, and sometimes the state will punish the extended families for that individual liberal's actions and speech. So it's a little bit tricky when we're trying to assess the realities on the ground from that perspective.
So I would just say on that point, and clarify, Marina, your question. So I'm talking about liberals who explicitly and publicly opposed the coups. So I'm talking about a specific period after July 3rd. And that's where I think that there wasn't a real risk to someone's life or livelihood. That was before the military started shooting people down. The first massacre happened several weeks later. So there was a moment, July 3rd to say July 6th, or even July 2nd, before the coup actually happened. There was a time for liberals to come out and say they were against it before the military came to power. But it's striking that even though there wasn't a clear and present danger to people's lives yet, again, almost no liberals, prominent liberals, came out and explicitly and publicly opposed the coup. And there were even some liberals and some friends of mine who are now in exile who had mixed messages on the eve, and that was very problematic to see. Yeah.
I agree with you. I just question whether they really thought what happened was a coup. I think one of the problems I saw were people incorrectly assessed what just happened. There were a significant number of self-described liberals, maybe not high profile, but just average Egyptians, who, by the way, aren't necessarily secularist. You can be liberal and still be, religious and a pious, practicing Muslim, who thought this was a way to get rid of who they thought was an illegitimate president in order to hold new elections. That's not to say that from a rule of law perspective that's acceptable, but they didn't see it as, let's get rid of Morsi and let the military govern. They thought actually maybe Baradei would run and then win, or there would be free and fair elections, because they thought that Mohamed Morsi was going to create a one vote, one time, outcome. I'm not saying I agree with that. So I'm just wondering if they assessed what had happened accurately, and it wasn't until after Rabaa that they realized this really was a military coup and we just got used.
Right. Well, I mean, we all know that Egyptians, many Egyptians who supported the coup were not comfortable using the word coup. And remember those annoying debates that we used to have with people on that, at least I used to have those debates with them, including my family members in Egypt. And part of that has to do with, I'm like, we don't have to rehash that, but basically my response was always, literally, this is the classic textbook academic definition of a coup. The military literally forcibly removed the president. Like, they can't be any more obvious than that. So, I mean, was it popular? Did it have popular support? Yes, but I think part of the delusions of liberals is they actually convinced themselves that this new regime would be respectful of individual rights and that this was a way to improve the country. And another liberal who, really a moral stain on his record, really, there's nothing he can do to undo it, is Mohamed Baradei. I mean, someone who was so naive and became a fig leaf for a really brutal regime. And I think it's really sad that someone of his stature, and I think in some sense he's a principled, honorable man. So again, it raises the question, how does such a seemingly principled, honorable man get duped into this the way he did?
History and say
Anyway.
that when we think of opposition historically in Egypt, we think of Islam or Muslim Brotherhood because the regime had by design eliminated the opportunities for secularists to form parties or even kind of come together. And through really interesting means, like the law on registering parties would say, oh, all of these are duplicate parties because they all are secular, right? Or they all are liberal. And so it was almost by design to kind of decapitate the formation of real liberal or secular parties. And so the idea that they would form and have large followings instantly is understandable. But yes, you're right. Yeah, it was several figureheads but the important thing for me is that not only were they emerging on and articulating new political platforms, but they did it in a very quick and concise way that says that Egyptian society and members of the political establishment and ostracized members of the political establishment can very quickly come together and envision an alternate future for themselves. I also want to talk about a couple of things that Dr. Hamid mentioned in his comments. When we think about liberal Democrats and the issue of the 2013, is it that we didn't trust Islamists or that we just didn't trust the process? Is that we didn't trust the democratic process, that it wouldn't work? And what we know about consolidating of democracy is that you can't even talk about consolidation until you've had at least 2 or 3 electoral cycles where people are voted in and voted out. And so was it that there wasn't trust in the democratic process? And that's what the key issue was? And when we actually think about, the religious discourse at this time, was the Muslim Brotherhood in that really short time period, right? Again, we measure things through this really short time period. Were they governing Islamically? What did that look like? Essentially, what did they do? Even in the 2005 to 2010 parliamentary session, what were their issues in Parliament? I'm not sure that we can argue that it was an Islamic conversation, right, to talk about education, the economy, and petro and chicken, for example, during the swine flu epidemic. So what was this fear? Even the conversation on Sharia in the Constitution, is a very long conversation. If you unpack that, they were pushing for this. They were willing to take the language out, right? And again, this is, we're talking about nuance here, but essentially my question is, what was the fear? The idea even of sitting out the coming elections, we tend today to talk about the Muslim Brotherhood as a monolith, right? Who speaks for the Muslim Brotherhood, right? Who represents them? Is the leadership in exile? In exile in which country? Are they in prison? So when we talk about strategies for the future, what they would do or what they could do, I think what needs to happen first is that there has to be an internal rethinking and an internal re-strategizing before we can kind of articulate for them what the strategy could be for the future. Although I think they would probably have to sit out if there was elections in the coming decade, just because they're not there. We know the first, second, and third tier are in prison, and the rest is in exile. When we get to the conversation on the Tunisian experiment about moving very quickly away from a presidential system, I remember just a week after the fall of Mubarak speaking to former parliamentarians, and that's exactly what they were talking about. For different reasons, right? Moving away from the presidential system, looking at a parliamentary system, because at that time, remember the conversation of, can a woman run for president? Well, if we move to a parliamentary system, then yes, she could be head of state and not head of government, not head of state. So there were very interesting conversations on very quickly moving away from a presidential system. But again, we're talking about a transition period that was so short, but also we're talking about a transition period that didn't really ever uncover real deep conversations on what transitional justice is going to look like. So yes, a lot is up in the air. And finally, to get to the conversation about liberals and during the coup and what they wanted and what they didn't want, I think for me the most disappointing thing was at that moment, did the liberals themselves not trust the process? Because essentially what they did, naively or not, say, military, here, take power because you are going to give us democracy. And so by talking in that kind of language, right, or freedom, or individualism, by talking that, then did liberals also themselves not trust the process? And what we know, what literature tells us, Egypt's not the first country to come into this, right? That the transition process is extremely difficult, fraught with violence and ups and downs, right? We don't have to look past Latin America to understand the history of the experience, right? We hold Spain as a model when Spain for a very long time was the south side of Chicago. And so if you think about what it is that liberals themselves essentially did not trust the process, then the problem essentially might be more deep than we are talking about.
Danish, do you have some comments about? Okay. So next questions, please.
I teach at the American University in Cairo, and I'm here at the Wilson Center this year. Thank you all for your presentations. I learned a lot. I just wanted to first make a comment that I think many of these liberal intellectuals that you all have mentioned, Ala Aswani, Mohammed al-Baradei, Sa'aduddin Ibrahim, many of them were born in the 1930s or 40s, and they really do belong to the older generation of Egyptian intellectuals. I personally, because I've been teaching at AUC since 2008, for 10 years now almost, I believe there's a very serious generational divide amongst Egyptians, and that the younger generation actually is different than many of these older intellectuals who you've mentioned. And if we look at the younger generation, in fact, so if we look at the National Salvation Front, Amr Moussa, Baradei, Hamdi and Sabahi, none of them are in prison, right? But if we look at the younger generation, Ala Abdel Fattah, Mahinur al-Masri, all of these young people, they are in prison. Mahinur was sentenced again to 2 years in prison just on December 30. She's already spent 2 years in prison, and she won the Ludovic Treviot International Human Rights Award. She's a human rights lawyer herself. It's the same award that Nelson Mandela won in 1985. So, I mean, I think there's sort of a different mentality amongst young Egyptians who are still, even now today, willing to go to prison for what they believe in. And I think that, you know, also the majority of the population in Egypt are under the age of 30, right? So I think we actually really have to take the young people seriously in Egypt. If we look at even Tamarod, right? If we look at the leaders of Tamarod, many of them, they did not even endorse Sisi for president in 2014. They endorsed Hamdin Sabahi. So if even Tamarod, you know, did not support Sisi in the presidential elections, what do you think other, you know, young activists were thinking and doing? And we don't hear about them, again, because many of them are in prison or they've been forced to go into exile, or, you know, they're just not famous people, so we don't know their names. But that's why it's also very important to distinguish between June 30 and July 3rd and August 14 and et cetera. I mean, so I think that many people did take part in the June 30 protests, actually did not support the return to military rule. And that is a very, very important distinction that we have to make. And if we don't make that distinction, we won't understand what's happening, and we won't see the potential for some kind of democratic change in Egypt. And so finally, I mean, I'd just like to ask, because we are here in Washington, as Radwan mentioned, you know, John Kerry said that the Egyptian military was restoring democracy. Trump has called Sisi a fantastic guy. I mean, so we also have to take responsibility here in the United States for supporting these illiberal tendencies in Egypt. And that I think it's not just, you know, the politicians, but also there are academics, there are, you know, political scientists who are writing things about democratic coup d'etats. Like who are arguing that a military coup could lead to a democratic transition. Maybe there are some countries where this could happen, but obviously it has not happened in Egypt. So I think that, you know, I guess my question is, what can we do here in the United States to, you know, maybe at the very least stop supporting the illiberal tendencies that are manifest in Egypt?
Thank you, Amy. Next.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, CSID and the panelists, for a great event so far. I have two questions. The first one is for Professor Aziz.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, yes, of course. Karen Guevara, Strategic Capacity Group. First one is for Professor Aziz. You mentioned that there's a lot of laws that are currently curtailing freedom. For instance, Public Law 70, which restricts NGO activity and can carry up to 5 years of imprisonment. Do you see this type of illiberal legislation stopping anytime soon, or do you see the continuation? And the second question may be out of scope for this, but interested to hear your thoughts, the panel in general, of how the instability in Libya, the political vacuum may affect Egypt. For instance, a lot of Syrian radicals are now moving to Libya, and some of them are going to Tunisia. Do you see this carrying over to Egypt? And if so, to what extent? What sort of implications will that have? Thank you.
Thank you. David?
Hi, I'm David Ballard. I have a pretty easy question for you. And that, well, first of all, you know, thank you for your presentation. When I was listening to you, I was thinking of myself. I'm a member of the American liberal intelligentsia in relatively good standing. And how would I approach that same question if, for example, I had a choice between a Christian Taliban Judge Moore type leadership and a military leadership? And I would stick with democracy, but that's easy for me to say. Because what I think in my 20 years experience of following Egypt and caring about Egypt, the thing that seems most missing to me is genuine commitment on everybody's part to freedom of expression, because we have a society, I mean, Egyptians are not shy people. They're not people who are not known for having something to say and saying it well, yet there is, on all sides, sometimes, in my opinion, a reticence to talk about things in a frank way. And so that's my question. How might that be encouraged in Egyptian society in general? Because it is my belief that more than any other country I know, that would go a long way towards solving problems.
Thank you. One last question.
Amr Darrag, Egyptian Institute for Studies. I will pick it up from Amy on the issue of youth, and also the last section of Shadi's talk as well. I believe we are being too harsh, a little bit too harsh on liberals, because this is not just a problem for liberals in Egypt, it's a problem for all Egyptians who were born after 1952 in Egypt, or at least saw the light after 1952. In Egypt, we've been living in an environment that was controlled, that has been controlled by the military over 70 years. So this is a problem for generations. Before 1952, we had a very good heritage of democratic practice, constitutional practices, and going back maybe 50 or 60 years before that, before many countries in the developed world right now. So, but after the military rule started in 1952, this changed a lot of things. So we have a problem that is unfortunately going to be there for a long time, and it requires generations to end. In a way which may seem a little bit funny, what I see right now in Egypt happening is a blessing. Because it seems to me like the military are making everything they can to wipe out any kind of sympathy or acceptance to their future role in Egypt the same way they have been doing over the last 70 years. And we will end up with a new generation that saw the light after 2011 that will be aiming to changing all this practice. And this includes liberals, Islamists, everybody. And so this comes to the point how to empower these young generations to go through this change. How we can allow the civil society, or help the civil society from whoever parties that, or whatever parties that would like to see any positive change in Egypt. How this can be achieved in order to help the Egyptians come up with a new model that will end up the ongoing control of the military. The military they say that they did not make a coup. It was Dr. Morsi who made a coup against the military, because the process has been like, this is a military served by a state. It is not a state served by the military. So this is their conviction, this is their faith. And in a way, this is unfortunately, this is the culture of many Egyptians, a lot of Egyptians who look up to the military. Egyptians have always been looking up to the military. So this is something culture that needs to be changed. And the military, what the military are doing right now, are doing a great help to cancel this conception. How can this be helped in order to come up with a new way of forming a new Egypt based on young generations without this culture of dominance of the military in Egypt?
I'm glad to see that Dr. Amr sees light at the end of the tunnel. So please, yes.
Okay, first of all, can you hear me? Okay, yes, very good. So first of all, I'm going to respond to the issue of encouraging the participation of the young generation. Agreed, a lot of the figures that we've discussed are in their 70s and 80s at this point, but I offer the very important caveat that not all figures under consideration are necessarily octogenarians. I mean, first, Ala al-Aswani was born in 1957, but even more germane, I think, is the case of someone like Ibrahim Isa, who was born in 1965. He's about 50 years old, and this is a figure that has personal resonance for me because it was during my time beginning my career in Egypt as a researcher and then as a journalist. I actually wound up defending Ibrahim Isa in an op-ed after he'd been arrested for the millionth time for irritating the Mubarak regime for whatever reason. So a figure of this magnitude who had been an avant-garde journalism, running at that point the only oppositional newspaper in Egypt, the Stour, wound up completely shifting gears to give rise to the coup, to ultimately argue that we can't allow Egypt to turn into another Iran. And perhaps even more interesting is the case of Bassem Youssef. Bassem Youssef is in his early 40s. He is, I would say, part of the young generation. I mention this to point out that even the youth is not immune to these proclivities and these tendencies. And while I very much agree. Excuse me?
But he supported the coup, but he was very vocal in support of the coup. And even the massacre, he had stuff still on Twitter, which was pretty much saying the Brotherhood deserved what they got
He
in
called them
Rabat.
Nazis.
Yeah.
And by the way, as a shameless plug, our book has a fabulous chapter on the issue of Bassem Youssef alongside Ala al-Aswani. But I mentioned this not to contest your point that we certainly do need to encourage participation of the young generation, the post-1960s generation. However, even the young generation is not wholly inoculated against some of these proclivities. And that's something we need to keep in mind.
Thank you. Dari?
So I wanted to talk to Dr. Darag's point about the military. So we know that for the past couple of years they've been consolidating power. It's becoming stronger and stronger. Is also afraid of itself. I mean, I really want us to think about, this Shafiq candidacy. And yeah, it looks like a soap opera, but he's a former military person who I don't think would have put himself forth for candidacy if he did not believe that there was support for himself from within the military. And why is it that the military is so afraid of candidates coming from within their own ranks? And so I think we're at an interesting moment in Egypt's history where we talk about the military also as a monolith, consolidating power around itself, but maybe when we talk about civil-military relations, it requires a deeper understanding of what's happening within the military today. Because not only are they afraid of society and opposition and kind of choking any civil society from articulating possible alternatives, but they're also doing that from within the military establishment as well. And so I worry, I know Dr. Darag is more optimistic, but I worry because this could lead to greater consolidation, which would lead to curtailing of, power in the periphery that could foment even more violence. And so I think we're at a critical juncture where understanding the future of Egypt also requires understanding what's happening within the military, if we can even get data on that.
I also want to remind you of the question that I think is very important, is what can the US do to help promote democracy in Egypt? And specifically for me, very important question, what can the Egyptian American community do to help promote democracy in Egypt?
So historically, when the US looks at Egypt, it looks at it through the lens of 4 issues, right? Sinai, or control of Sinai, flyover rights over Sinai, Camp David, and access to the Suez Canal. And now more recently, of course, cooperation on counterterrorism. And that's about it. It's not about democracy promotion, it's not about civil society engagement, it's not about those kinds of issues. And it's telling that during the President Obama's administration, if you follow his General Assembly statements on what the United States is looking forward in the future, when he came to talk about Egypt, and this is after 2013, it was those 4 points that he said, we will put the military might behind those things. Other issues, such as human rights, we can discuss those things. And so all of a sudden, those become negotiable, and security is not, or the prism through which we see security is not. But what we know today more than ever, that continuing to see Egypt through that lens, as if democracy and security are 2 sides of the same coin, and so we'll choose the stability of repression, so-called stability of repression, for the sake of security, is no longer a paradigm. We know that today Egypt is more insecure than ever before. Sinai, we don't like to talk about it, but Sinai doesn't really have a strong military presence. The government itself can't control what's happening in Sinai. And so we continue to see Egypt through this prism, that we hedge short-term gains for long-term benefit. For example, if we understand that stability through democracy and pluralism will lead to long-term benefits for the United States, it would require a rethinking of the entire paradigm. But again, that's seeing Egypt as separate from the rest of North Africa, the Levant, and the Middle East, right? There is crisis all over the area. And so whether it's seeing Egypt through the lens of Tunisia, of what's happening in Israel, of what's happening in Syria and Lebanon, of what's happening in Turkey, the more variables you add, the more we have to reconfigure what is this new so-called world order under President Trump going to look like. It's seeming that it might be very different than what it was under President Obama because we were kind of playing both sides of the card. Today, it is no longer about human rights and individual liberties. Even the curtailing of aid because of human rights violations, we know we're not, right? It was because of sales of arms to North Korea. And so, or purchasing from North Korea. And so when we talk about that, also looking at the prism of the role of Russia today, what we're going to have to rethink is that we can no longer look at sites like Egypt as a site of contestation of other foreign powers at the expense of its population, because that's going to reverberate to greater instability, not just for the region, but for all of us.
What about the Egyptian American community? I understand there is about 1 million Egyptians in America.
Yeah, and they're all my relatives now. So if we look at, for example, the maturity of Egyptian Americans, of Muslim Americans, of Coptic Americans in the United States, it's kind of evolved over time. Historically, we used to, up until the 2000 election, political involvement was for foreign policy, right? Today, we know that political involvement of diaspora communities is more for their interest as members of the American society, right? What does Islamophobia do to you? What are narratives like that? And so how do you balance between foreign policy objectives as well as what's happening here in the United States? What the diaspora community has to do is just simply continue to become more politically involved. It's not about these big kind of protests or buses in New York City. It's more about, I think, continuing to lobby your members of Congress, get politically involved, donate to campaigns, understand what it means to be a civic-minded, engaged American who's going to hold those they elect into office accountable. And I think that continues to be one of the challenges that we face.
Thank you.
So I will answer multiple questions and not try to be duplicative. But with regard to the organizing and the mobilization, as I stated in my comments, there is no political space by design, and I think that's really the biggest challenge right now, is the way the system is structured, or the political repressive system is structured, and it's nothing new, is for youth, for example, to stay apolitical. So there's a difference between complaining, making political jokes, sitting at a hookah bar and talking trash about the government. But that's acceptable as long as it doesn't translate into mobilization, right? Similarly, you have to be careful about mobilization on non-political issues. What I've noticed is whenever the government sees, and this current regime and past regimes, sees mobilization occur, even if it's on apolitical issues, they could be sports, right? It could be labor. It's just about wages. We're not trying to overthrow the government. We just want more wages, or we don't want unsafe work conditions. They see that as fungible, so it can be transferred, those skill sets or those same networks can then be transferred into some kind of political mobilization. So I think that the challenge is trying to see how we can allow citizens to engage in collective engagement, civic engagement, and to the extent people are engaged in American foreign policy, I think that's a really important avenue or a policy point that needs to be focused on, although I'm not very optimistic. With regard to liberals supporting the coup or not supporting the coup, I think part of the problem is that liberals are very classist. Well, Egyptians are very classist, and classism, similar to, I would equate it with racism in America, is deeply rooted in Egyptian society and Egyptian culture, to the extent that many of those who identified as liberal were also middle or particularly upper middle class, the intelligentsia. And I remember having discussions with them, asking them, so, where have you gone around Egypt to grow your popularity? And I would have sarcastic responses. If you want me to go to the Ariyef, to the Fallahin, to the rural areas and talk to those people, and I thought, well, that's what it means to be a politician. If you want their votes, you've got to go out and shake their hands and talk to them and find out what they want. And these were urbanites who thought, no, that's not my job. I'll just go on television and I'll write my op-eds and I'll do my international media. So they didn't, and that kind of goes to Marina's point, is they didn't understand what it meant to play politics in a meaningful way, right, beyond being a pundit. Being a pundit is not being a politician running for office and on a policy platform. So that is a structural problem and a cultural problem that does need to be addressed, and I think that's why the Muslim Brotherhood were so successful, because they weren't that way. With regard to the use of laws, this is a very common tactic, using law to perpetuate authoritarianism, and the real political science question is why? Why would a dictator even need to use law? Why need an independent judiciary? Why not just be an authoritarian? We all know you are. This isn't just unique to Egypt. And so the story on Egypt is, ever since Sadat wanted to liberalize the economy, and he also wanted to get more foreign aid from the United States and aid from other international organizations, he and Mubarak, and to some extent Sisi continues this, is they play this game where there is some liberalization, or I should say there's some rule of law, but it's very, very constrained, and it's only for the purpose of soliciting these rents, right? International aid, particularly military aid, and foreign investment, but it is not meant to benefit the public. It is not meant to grant individual freedoms. And so the courts are given some leeway so that they can signal that, in fact, we're serious, that if you invest your money in our country, we won't nationalize it, we won't expropriate it, so please invest. And also to give cover to the United States that, although we all know from a realist perspective doesn't really care about human rights, not a priority, but it does have an American public that it has to at least tell that we don't just support genocide outright, or we don't support things that are extreme in human rights, and we can show this as, look, they have these indicia of rule of law, even though they're not very meaningful. And then finally, with regard to foreign policy, I tend to be as skeptical as Dalia. I don't think America's ever operated that way. I think the joke's on us as American citizens, frankly. I think we're very naive. I think we're as naive as the Egyptian youth revolutionaries who went into Tahrir on June 30th, thinking that they were having Revolution 2.0 rather than military coup 3.0. And we have to be realistic about what our government's foreign policy is, and it's very much about human rights, especially under this administration. We can argue that it ebbs and flows under some administrations, but it's generally on the lower, priority list. So the question is, what do we want to do as a society to pressure our governments to prioritize human rights and to say, we believe it's in our national security for there to be long-term stability, not short-term stability, which we believe is based on some form of indigenous democracy, some form of self-governance, some form of open society that's indigenous, and that we think we're less safe in the long run by contributing to a region that is clearly volatile and exploding in, no pun intended, in all sorts of conflicts, which maybe some people think that's good for us. We sell a lot of arms that way, right? So it helps our defense industry. It increases our defense budget. So some people may think it's actually good to have conflict in some regions, as long as it doesn't boomerang back to us, which is why we're so afraid of homegrown terrorism and the lone wolf terrorists. So I think that it's about American citizens deciding as a matter of principle that we are very serious about human rights, and that is going to be something we talk to our represented officials about, and that is part of our own political culture. And with regard to Egyptian Americans, they're very diverse, they're very fractured, and they're very divided. So I don't think that can be discussed as a homogeneous group. I think, in my opinion, the most benefit the Egyptian Americans can do to Egypt is to continue to remain engaged in Egypt, to work with their counterparts there, whether it's on business, on civil society, and you know, family relations. And I think over time, you then get a sense of, you become better informed on what you can do here if you want to do something, so that you're not as subject to what I think is a lot of propaganda coming from Western and Egyptian media about the degree and the nuances of problems, as Amy mentioned, with youth. So I think the more we engage and the more that we, at a human level, at a peer-to-peer, citizen-to-citizen level, then organically we can decide based on our own faction within the Egyptian American communities plurally, what we can do to support what I think is a more stable Egypt through democratic, pluralistic processes.
So to Dr. Amr's point, in 1952 and Nasser and the revolution has come up. I mean, obviously Egyptians didn't know it at the time, but I think looking back, knowing what we know now, 1952 is one of the worst things that could have possibly happened to the Egyptian people. And in some ways, that has set the tone for so many other developments in the region of this kind of statist authoritarianism, the idea that the military or certain groups of elites are guardians of the state. Nasser essentially spread that throughout the region. So I think, you know, I wish 1952 never happened, and it shouldn't have happened. It did, and now we have to pay the price for a very long time. As for young people, I'm a little bit, I don't actually trust young people, generally speaking. I'm very skeptical of any, because I mean, it's very tempting to say young people are the future. First of all, young people historically are more prone to radicalism and violence. I mean, ISIS was in some ways a youth movement. But putting that aside, the problem with young people is that they eventually stop being young. And they end up having terrible views when they get older. This is all, I mean, that's just the way it works, you know? So I would just be very careful about seeing hope in young people. And you know, we don't have a lot of great data, but the young people that I knew in Egypt, I would not put, never mind, I don't want to be too negative. But, and just, yeah, on what the US can do. Sorry? Oh yeah, right. So I think that we don't talk a lot about the Obama administration, and I mean, we've sort of moved beyond that because Trump seems so bad that it almost feels weird to criticize Obama, because those seem like the good old days. But I think it's worth reminding ourselves that the Obama administration very self-consciously de-emphasized democracy promotion in the Middle East, and was very uncomfortable, with maybe the exception of the first half of 2011, but even then, the Obama administration was uncomfortable with the Arab Spring, very uncomfortable with the Arab Spring. And, you know, again, this is a counterfactual, I don't know, but, you know, sometimes I think that President Obama would have been a great president for the time right after the September 11th attacks, and Bush would have been a great president for the Arab Spring. I just think they were temperamentally in the wrong time. And I do think that one of the positive things about the second Bush administration, they didn't follow up on their rhetoric, but I think it is worthwhile to look back and say there was something called the Freedom Agenda. Granted, we didn't live up to our own rhetoric, but that was the first time that an American president really elevated democracy promotion, at least rhetorically, to the top of the agenda, and it made a difference in 2005. It really did, and I was living in the region at the time, and I remember the sense of optimism that people were feeling, in part because they knew that the US was at least in some way theoretically on their side. It does make a difference, and I think there was a major missed opportunity with the Arab Spring, and Obama should really, I think we should hold him to account on that in terms of how we process his legacy. And I think Trump is taking it maybe several steps further, but Trump in some ways is continuing the orientation of the Obama administration. He's taking it to its logical conclusion. Now, I'm optimistic in the sense that I believe that the US can change, and I've always believed that, but that depends on people like us. It depends, are there enough Americans who believe this is important, you know, as others have said, to our foreign policy, and I hope one day there will be a president who really believes in this stuff. It can happen. the US is not doomed to repeat the same mistakes forever. Maybe in 30 years there will be a president that we knew, that maybe a friend of ours here in DC, that was influenced by the kinds of conversations we're having. That person becomes an influential figure and is maybe Secretary of State or maybe even the president. Who knows? But I mean, we shouldn't give up hope that the US, unlike other countries, I think is capable in the long run of learning from its mistakes. It just takes a very long time.
But I think you have to make the case normatively and ideally, empirically, that it is in the nation's interest for there to be some form of self-governance, quasi-democratic, I use democrat with a small d, for the US. Because right now the problem is that the prevailing view is that it is not in our best interest, that what's in our best interest is to have a dictator who listens to us and represses his people who don't want to follow what we tell them to do. And I don't think that's accurate. And it's interesting that no one seems to be connecting the dot between the lack of stability and outright violence in the region with these dictatorships. This is what baffles
Well, to be fair, the Bush administration was the main proponent of that argument that you can't have long-term stability without democracy, but even they end up supporting dictators in the end. It's very hard, even if you realize intellectually that it's better in the long run. The problem is the long run seems like a long time away, and you have to think about short-term national security interests. And I think that our system is oriented around short-termism. And I think that, so it's hard, it's difficult, but yeah, anyway.
Can I add to that? I think that the other thing is that there's no US president that would be caught dead in office being perceived to be behind a political movement that might put the Muslim Brotherhood or any Islamist regime in power. I mean, when you can't read the cards, which is exactly what happened to the United States, you are not going to take the chance. And if any of you, and I think most of you, have been in Egypt anytime recently, you know that the entire country of Egypt blames the rise of Daesh on Hillary Clinton, which is crazy talk, right? So, I mean, the fact that Obama managed to somehow scathe that scandal and it all ended up on Hillary's lap is amazing. But I think that the American regime is no different than the illiberal intelligentsia that you're describing, which is we're willing to support democracy up until a point that democracy might end up in the hands of Islamists. So what do we do knowing that that's a fact? So knowing that the media has been curtailed, knowing that there's no education, knowing that the youth has either been silenced, disillusioned, or put in jail, then I want to know what can you guys do to help me to raise my level of idealism and optimism to curtail the pessimism that I share to some extent with Shadi, but I do have hope that there is still change, and I do think a lot of it still is going to be on the shoulders of youth, because I think the old don't have faith in the process, and I think the youth might be maybe the only hope that we have, that there is some sense of naivete that democracy can take hold, inshallah. And I am Delilah Khalid from the Center for Global Policy. Sorry to jump into the conversation.
I think we also need to decriminalize Islamism, Islamists in the United States. I think that has led us down some very, very poor analysis on foreign policy, and tell Americans that, if you think that Islamists should all be in jail, then your entire evangelical movement of voters is going to end up in jail if we followed that same reasoning. But instead, what you have here is you have secularists and you have Christianists. I mean, I think there's such thing as the Christian Brotherhood. They don't identify as such, but they certainly behave in the same way, and there are political parties where that's their primary base. And say, do you think they should all go to jail simply because you don't agree with them? No. Play the political game. Sometimes they'll win, sometimes they'll lose, and they'll evolve, as Dadia said, is eventually over time, who they were today will be completely different than who they are in 10 years or 20 years as they have to play through the political process.
Well, thank you all. Thank you, Danish. Thank you, Dalia. Thank you, Sahar. And thank you, Shadi. Really excellent discussion. One of the best I've seen in a long time. And I think that in concluding remarks, CSID has been doing this kind of work for 19 years, close to 20 now. And we really started with the same questions that we ended with today, which is how do we convince the US government that democracy is in our interest, and that we should not support dictators in the world, and especially in the Middle East, and that actually is not in our interest, and that doesn't create stability. And I felt in 2003 through 2006 and 2007 that we had made progress, that everybody, at least at that time, every policy makers was saying the right thing, that we want democracy, we want freedom, including the right of Islamists to participate in the political process. Everybody who knows anything about the Middle East knows that if you don't include the Islamists in the political process, you cannot have a democracy. I mean, that just is very clear. And that if we really want democracy, that the Islamists have to participate in the political process, and that they will evolve and they will accept the rules of the game, and that Islamists are not all the same. There are extremists and terrorists like Daesh and others, but to say that all Islamists are the same is also a very dangerous thing to do, and that's why even the word Islamist has bad connotations or should be changed, in my opinion. In Tunisia, the Nahda movement doesn't use that term anymore. They say we are Muslim Democrats, just like Christian Democrats in Europe. And they are, by the way, the majority, or at least they have been a majority until very recently in the European Parliament. They are Christian Democrats. So I think it seems clear that after 20 years of doing what we have been doing, we still have our work cut out for us. But I really believe in the role of the community, and the Egyptian community, which is almost 1 million strong in America, really should take the lead, in my opinion. They should take the lead in educating themselves, in educating Egyptians in Egypt, and in pushing the US policies to do the right thing in Egypt and in the region. 1 million strong can make a huge difference in US foreign policy if they are active, if they are organized. So, in my opinion, I really can't blame the Egyptians who live in Egypt. I can't blame them, because they know that if they open their mouth, actually, if they think about opening their mouth, they'll pay the price before they even open their mouth. They'll be fired, they'll be in jail, But what is the excuse of the people who live here in America, who have citizenship, who have all the safety and all the security and all the money that they can ever dream of? And yet, they only think about themselves and don't think about what they can do for Egypt. And I think, to expand that, the Muslim community as a whole in America is guilty of isolationism in the last 10 years. We only talk about our civil liberties. Yes, I mean, it's fine to talk about our civil liberties. What about the liberties overseas? We are in heaven compared to what people are seeing in Egypt or elsewhere in the Middle East. And yet, that's what we want to talk about, is our civil liberties and Islamophobia over here. It's a problem. It's a growing problem. But we also have a very important role to play to help real democracy grow and prosper in Egypt and in the region. And if we don't do it, who's going to do it? I don't think people who live in Egypt can do it in front of an army, that is, 1 million or 700,000 or whatever strong, and now controlling 60% of the economy. Anyway, thank you very much all for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you at future events. Hopefully, Egypt, I'm confident that the future of Egypt will be a bright one. Thank you.